Hello everybody, so today we are going to be doing even more of responding to Caelan Conrad, the massive Caelan Conrad 5.5 hour series about how being gender critical is apparently a cult. So let's jump in. There we go.
They pick an image of someone who appears to be male despite the superficial things that they're wearing. This is to enforce the idea that trans women are men in a dress, men in a wig, men in lipstick.
Okay, let's be clear. What it is it's to get across that this is what you're advocating for. Because a lot of people are very deeply sexist, and a lot of people, I think, have the intuitive idea that if somebody looks convincing as a stereotypical woman, then, oh, that's fine, they're a woman, it doesn't matter. So, and that is, of course, a very sexist way of thinking, because you're assuming that because of stereotypes, that legitimizes somebody being a woman. But the point is, people are raised, we live in a very sexist, patriarchal society, so many people out there will say, oh, that person looks like a woman, it's fine. So the way you break through that sexism is by, and the way you make people realize, no, what you're advocating for, it doesn't matter how convincing they look, you're still talking about men in women's spaces, is you have to find something which people will recognize as a man. The point is, gender critical feminists don't care how convincing a trans-identified male looks. Gender critical feminists aren't going to be like, oh, well, don't worry, they've had the surgery and the facial feminization surgery, so it's fine. No, they don't care. But the point is that if they post examples of people who do look somewhat convincing, then a lot of people who are sexist, who do have that idea of, well, if they look like a woman, it's fine. If they look stereotypically like a woman, it's fine, in order to break through and get through to those people. So that's the reason why it's done. It's not because there aren't, trans-identified males who do look at least somewhat convincing as biological females, but rather because those individuals are playing into the sexist patriarchal idea of, well, I look like a woman, therefore I must be a woman, because that's what a woman is, right? A woman's somebody who wears a dress and has long hair and wears makeup and has a particular facial structure and all that kind of stuff. That's basically what they're doing, and obviously, therefore, gender critical feminists would be against that, but patriarchal society would generally not be.
Who do not take off their womanhood at the end of the night the way someone can take off a dress, a wig, or lipstick.
Okay, but the thing is, this is pointless because you haven't defined woman. So you're not making a point. You're saying like, oh, they don't take off their womanhood. Okay, but as far as I'm concerned, you literally might as well be saying anything else. You might be saying, they don't take off their blah, 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 because you haven't defined womanhood. And therefore, you haven't defined woman, and you haven't, by extension, defined womanhood. So you're not making a point. When you make confident, assertive statements about words which you haven't defined, you're not actually saying anything at all. If you haven't defined woman, then it's meaningless to say they don't take off their womanhood. Okay, I don't even know what you think you mean by that statement.
When confronted with a trans woman who looks like a woman in a dress, wig, and lipstick, they have to change up the party line just a bit.
Well, look, again, I want to stress, it's consistent. The point is, if it's a woman in a dress, if it's somebody who looks like a woman in a dress, then what I would say is, yes, that is what I've always objected to. The idea of any biological male entering women's spaces, the idea of any biological male declaring themselves to be a woman when there is no good argument to regard them as such. The only reason why I would ever appeal to examples of trans-identified males who do not look more typically like women is to break through to the logic of people who disagree with me on my beliefs about how stereotypical femininity should have nothing to do with womanhood.
To gender critical people makes her a homosexual male. Mm-hmm. So she should have some support, right? Given that she's one of the classes they're looking to protect.
That's a really dumb thing to say, because obviously the point is, yes, they do have, this individual does have support as a homosexual male. That's why the statement literally was, just be a homosexual male, dude. That was one of the quotes that was shown. I don't know if I'm going to include it in the edit, but that was one of the quotes that was shown. So, yes, they would have support based on that. I'm interested to see how that's going to be contradicted.
But the gender critical conspiracy theory is that it's internalized homophobia that makes a gay male want to be a straight female.
But you're saying but that does not contradict. So that would show exactly how they have support as a gay male. Like, I don't understand what you're missing here. You're saying that gender critical people support gay men being gay, but they don't like the idea of gay men claiming to be women. And then what you've shown is exactly evidence of that. And I'm left wondering, what's the problem?
She knew that Tommy transitioning just did not align with the worldview of gender critical ideology.
This makes no sense. A man who was comfortable enough with his homosexuality to get married to a man suddenly thinks he's trans. I think his friends convinced him he's trans.
So how do...
Okay, I just need to address that. So apparently, this idea makes no sense. As if, like, it's impossible for somebody to have delayed effects from internalized homophobia. Like, that's basically my response. Like, the question is, well, how is it that this person was comfortable and happy living as a gay man and then later on changed? And it's like, well, because internalized oppression can have delayed responses. It's not just like a quick, immediate thing. So that's really all there is to say on that. But this entire thing was supposed to be about somebody who looks like a woman in a dress. And so far, we haven't actually seen an example of this person. What's their name? So I've looked them up. And I think we're all clear on the fact this person does not look like a woman in a dress at all. Oh no. Like, because I was kind of thinking, like, hold on a minute. The entire, like, premise of this thing was supposed to be like, well, how do they react when there's somebody who looks like a woman in a dress? And then you get this whole thing about Tommy Dorfman, and I'm like, wait a minute, we haven't actually seen a picture of Tommy Dorfman yet. Like, there hasn't been, like, you would think it would be like, what about somebody who looks like a woman in a dress? It shows how, like, disorganized the video is, because it's like you will constantly get segues that don't actually lead to what they're supposed to be talking about. Because this could have just been, like, introduced as, like, oh, they say things about you know, like, internalized homosexuality, and just spoken about that. Oh, internalized homophobia. They could have just, like, Caelan could have just been like, oh, they talk about internalized, but instead you have this, like, weird, bizarre segue of, like, well, this is how they react to people who do look convincingly like women. There's non-Tims that look more female. That is a good point. I mean, heck, like, when I've shaved, like, genuinely, when I've shaved, do I look much less female than this person?
And despite knowing it wasn't true, blamed Tommy's transition on internalized homophobia anyway.
No, you haven't evidenced that there is any knowledge that this is not true. There is no reason to doubt that this was internalized homophobia. The only evidence given that it was not internalized homophobia is that this person was somewhat happy, or seemingly happy, living as a gay male for some amount of time, or a gay man for some amount of time. But again, that's not relevant at all, because, of course, internalized systemic oppression can have delayed effects. So it's not... By no means is it doesn't really function at all as a refutation of the idea that internalized homophobia is responsible. And it certainly doesn't mean we can say that we know internalized homophobia wasn't anything to do with it.
Trans women are either the gross pervy man that looks like a man dressed as a woman from fetish porn, or the gross pervy man that looks like a woman but is still dressed as a woman from fetish porn. They post from subreddits and Twitter.
The self-contradiction, literally the whole thing you were just saying is that, like, literally about, 5 minutes ago, we got the whole thing about the whole point of this section was supposed to be that the way they treat biological males who look like men is different from the way they treat biological males who look like women. And yet here, you've just said that actually they treat them the same. So, what are you doing, Caelan? You're contradicting yourself. I don't get it. You're literally just like, you're contradicting the entire point of what you just said earlier. I don't understand it. I mean, I remember at the beginning, like right at the beginning of the video, you were like, oh, everything just poured out. Yeah, okay, fine. It's all right to have everything pour out, but that's not a reason to avoid going back and making sure you get more than the first draft, where you don't find yourself contradicting your own point within the space of like 5 minutes.
By being trans, they are tainting the purity of the sex binary that must be maintained to assert gender-critical power, privilege.
No. Okay, first of all, gender critical power, privilege. Dude, you're talking about women. Like, what happened where these people just got so far removed from the reality of feminism that they're saying like, oh yeah, women, they have all the power and privilege. But also, okay, on the subject of the purity of the sex binary, first of all, if we're talking about some kind of moral purity, there is no moral purity to the sex binary. It's literally an entirely uninteresting, objective fact of reality. I say uninteresting, I mean, sure, it's interesting if you're like a biologist, but it's really, you know, like certainly it's not morally or like emotionally interesting. It's just like, oh yeah, biological males and biological females exist. Like if somebody, I don't know, disagrees with that, then I'm not gonna be like, oh, you're tainting the purity. No, I'm just gonna be like, okay, why do you think it doesn't exist? And I suspect you're wrong. Like that's it. It's not. So if therefore we're talking about, you know, because obviously it's not a moral thing. So maybe it's saying tainting the purity in terms of like its intellectual veracity, but it's still undeniably true. Like somebody being trans doesn't make the sex binary any less true. So I literally have no idea what you're saying. This would have been a better point if it was being made about intersex people. Like again, I hate to do it where I like give these people advice on how to make better videos. But if you wanted to make this point, you should have like if you're gonna make stuff up anyway, you might as well have made up that gender critical people hate intersex people. Because, and you know, obviously I realize intersex is, you know, obviously the proper term would be more differences of sexual development, but you know, I'm just saying the type of terminology that I imagine Caelan would use. So yeah, you could have said that gender critical people hate people with differences of sexual development because it ruins the sex binary, and that would have made more sense than saying that they hate trans people. Because it's like, look, I assure you that you saying you're non-binary does not in any way ruin the sex binary. The sex binary is still very obvious and unaffected by your nonsense claims.
Recycling the same old articles, the same old stories, the same old myths, a rapist in a dress, a penis, a
I mean, there is like a massive irony to the fact that this whole thing's supposed to be like gender critical people lie about what trans people are really like in order to justify their ideology or something like that. And it's just like, that's what you're doing. You're making up this like straw man of a gender critical person in your head. I mean, it's not a straw man, frankly, it's a scarecrow. Something for you to be scared of and be like, oh god. But like, it's just in reality, literally, it's we're just there. Like, can you evidence your claims, please? Like that's it. You just got somebody going, I'm non-binary. I'm not a man or a woman. And then you just got a bunch of other people being like, well, that doesn't really make much sense. I mean, how are you understanding the terms man and woman such that you would say you're neither one nor the other? I mean, surely it makes sense to say that a man is a biological male and a woman's a biological female. Like, that would just seem to be a way of defining the terms that work. So I'd be interested to know what way you're defining the terms and how this identity of yours as non-binary fits into that. And then Caelan's just like, and then they started imagining I was horrible and disgusting, and I must have just been destroying the purity of their whole thing. And we're just there like, can you maybe make what you're saying make sense, please, so we can try and understand it? Please? That would be nice. No? Okay, you're just gonna say that we're all horrible, evil, scary people who, like, wanna, I don't know, like, destroy all the trans people so we can have all our privilege. Reality, like reality privilege, reality acknowledging privilege.
But you are going to start inserting yourselves into spaces that are specifically for women and girls. Maybe.
So basically, I mean, let's be clear on what this seems to be from a first glance. This seems to be accelerationist, right? Like, which is actually a very legitimate point. And I've often thought to myself, you know, like, would it make sense for me to start calling myself a woman and get access to loads of, you know, like specific kind of things reserved for women with the logic of like, well, that would help people realize this is nonsense. Obviously, I've always thought, well, I'd never actually do it, but it's kind of, it is a legitimate point of view that actually the accelerationist approach of getting as many people who see that this is nonsense to start intentionally doing the most absurd things to make it clear how nonsense this is so that people realize the problem, so that it changes. That is a legitimate point of view to have. And yeah, I obviously I wouldn't do it. And I think it's kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't really agree with Posey Parker suggesting people do it, but it seems to me to be accelerationism, which is a legitimate strategy in any kind of political discourse. To, like I say, make things, so the logic of accelerationism, for anybody who isn't clear, is you basically make things intentionally worse in order to provoke people to realize the problem. Because sometimes when things are just trundling along, hello Lisa, when things are just trundling along and they're pretty bad, but not so bad, it's just keeping things ticking over, people won't see anything wrong, they won't have a problem. But as soon as you make things even worse intentionally, that's when you can actually achieve results. And yeah, I'm seeing some people say they don't agree with it in the comments. And yeah, I personally think it's a very risky move. And obviously, again, there's also the fact of, can you morally kind of justify doing it, even, do the ends justify the means?
You are transphobic. You're already there. You might as well, what is it? You might as well be be hung for a sheep than a lamb. You might as well.
Okay, I don't know why it included that bit where Posey just like stumbled over her words. Like I'm not sure why that was worth including. But yeah, basically, I think she was trying to say like you might as well be lambs for this. I don't know what she was trying to say, to be honest. But here's the thing: like I do remember somebody was like, "Oh, you should watch this series because it will expose how terrible Posey Parker is," and I was like, "Okay, I'll be interested," because I've got no reason to refuse to condemn Posey Parker if she says something that I think is objectionable. I mean, really, there's a question of would I individually condemn a specific thing she said versus would I condemn her overall as a person? Because, of course, you can condemn something that somebody specifically said, but you don't necessarily have to condemn them as a person. But anyway, so I was kind of, I was talking to someone like, how can you support a movement that has Posey Parker in it? And I was like, well, I don't really know much about like what Posey Parker said that's apparently horrendous. I'll say based on that, I mean, obviously we had the kind of accelerationist thing, which again, I personally wouldn't agree with, but I would say it's just a difference in kind of strategy. And then apart from that, you had a few other claims, which I didn't even respond to because I think those claims are completely legitimate. And yeah, there's no, I don't see any issue with those claims. So thus far, I've still got no reason to want to condemn Posey Parker.
In films, when they show someone being brainwashed, they're sitting there in front of a screen and they're just being fed propaganda.
Fred. They're just being Fred. They're just being Fred.
Someone being brainwashed, they're sitting there in front of a screen and they're just being fed proper.
When you're just being Fred. Fred the YouTuber.
Oh my god, that was almost so embarrassing. Sometimes I don't think I know anything about women.
Get my house!
I was thinking like Fred Propaganda might be his full name. Oh no, it's Mr. Propaganda. Oh please, just call me Fred.
They are addicted to this hate. They need it. They revel in it. They go through it themselves, staring at their little fucking phone. Why?
I like how this is basically just taking a very common observation about society in general and just specifically acting as if it only applies to gender critical people. This idea of people being addicted to these strong emotions that they can get from having a smartphone all the time, they can just look at all the stuff that's going to make them angry or excited, like that idea of basically we as a society are no longer, moved by the mild kind of thrills offered by like just the natural world, and instead we have to get all of like the biggest stimulation we can. Obviously, I mean, there is a particular industry that massively appeals to men and massively exploits women that is relevant here, but it applies to, I think, just in general the internet. This idea of you can get all of these new like thrills, everything's incredible, look at all this stuff, and again, a lot of the time might even be negative emotions because people don't like. People often find, I mean, obviously, for example, fear, like horror movies and things like that, like people can find negative emotions cathartic in some ways. But the point is, we're obsessed with just finding like the even bigger anger, even more embarrassment. You know, I remember when I first discovered the cringe subreddit, it was just like, even just the most awkward thing would make me cringe. But now it's like, I need the most awkward thing I can in order to find the cringe. I need to seek out whatever cringe I can at any opportunity. And that's the thing, like, maybe if I didn't have the internet, I would have just, back in the Middle Ages, I'm sure that, two people accidentally bumping into each other was enough cringe to have them going for the entire month. But, we as a society have become much more desensitized to that kind of stuff now. The point is, this is just an observation about society in general. It's not like a unique take. Everyone knows this. The only thing that seems to be unique here is Caelan acting as if this applies uniquely and consistently to gender critical people. And that's when you realize this is just a very dumb take. Basically, Caelan has observed some people on the internet doing what a lot of people on the internet do, like a very well observed phenomenon on the internet, and has just decided to be like, well, that must be because they're gender critical and part of this cult. Okay, so how do you explain all of the other examples online of people engaging in this exact same kind of behavior where they always, like literally there's the entire subreddit on Reddit, like the rage subreddit. I've been on it a few times, and eventually I decided I wasn't really into it. But like it literally just, it exists to show you things that will make you super angry. And the funny thing is, guess what? It's not filled with gender critical people. It's not like every single post is about how trans identified people are annoying. It's just about any old anger inducing thing. Because like I say, people actually do, enjoy that kind of stuff. But that's the point. This isn't about gender critical people. You're just making a very obvious observation about society and acting as if you're exposing the gender criticals.
They don't even really fight for women, only against trans people. They see threats everywhere, from JanSport bags.
They do fight for women, and also we do other things. Like, again, you get this, it's the hypocrisy, right? There is a refusal to understand gender critical people as actual fully formed human beings. Instead, they're just reduced to, just scary, evil people who hate you. The hypocrisy just, wow.
You know what? Let me show you gender critical ideology in practice in the real world.
So it's going to be like, oh, look, there's somebody who looks like a biological male, but they're in a woman's toilet. And it's like, okay, like, here's the thing. Even granting that, the best case scenario here is you're saying, well, no matter what, there are going to be people who look like biological males in women's toilets. But, okay, whatever, fine. There's on top of that the fact that within gender critical ideology, the people who are going to be doing this are not going to be kind of actively encouraged with this mass propaganda campaign, which is trying to turn all of the lesbians into trans men. So it's going to be less of an issue. And then on top of that, the reality is that fully like transitioned biological females who look like biological males are actually quite rare. Whereas conversely, there are an infinite well, or practically infinite well, of men who look like biological males who could just decide one day that they're biologically female. So if this is a problem, and it's a problem potentially in both worldviews, that there could be people who look like biological males in women's spaces, you have the fact that it is far more consistently and far more readily going to be a problem in the trans identity point of view, and also the fact that in the gender critical point of view, even while the people might look like biological males, and it might make some women uncomfortable, there is the fact that they're not biological males. And on top of that, let's be real here, you've also got to bear in mind that this would have to be a trans-identified female who is going to look convincingly biologically male when it comes to things which can't really be changed by surgery, like bone structure and things like that.
Do you want men who look like this to use the women's room? Well, gender critical people do. A lot more than trans people do.
What do you mean a lot more than trans people do? That's literally the opposite to the truth.
Is that gender critical ideology pretends to include trans adult men in their feminism.
In other words, yeah, gender critical feminism includes biological females.
This is, again, disingenuous.
How is it disingenuous? Like, trans-identified females are 100% being included in the feminism.
GC people like to pretend that trans men are just confused women. Worth noting the sexist dichotomy of this compared to how trans women are all predatory men. But
it's not a sexist dichotomy. It's not a dichotomy to observe that groups raised within different, subject to different systemic oppressions will and privileges will behave differently reliably. Like, yes, it's not, for example, it's not illegitimate for a feminist to talk about how women are likely to be passive. For example, that is one of the things that's very relevant when talking about the wage gap, that a lot of the time women tend to be socialized to be less assertive, which means they're less likely to ask for increased wages, whereas men are more likely to be raised to be assertive and therefore are likely to ask for wages. So that's actually a very useful way to explain why we still have an unexplained pay gap. So that's a point which starts by noticing that men and women are likely to behave differently based on how they've been socialized. It's not a sexist dichotomy by any means.
They are fair game for gender-critical cultists, and they do not hold back.
See, I'm assuming this is just going to be that, like, essentially because gender-critical feminists criticize trans-identified females, therefore they're not including them in their feminism. But that's not true at all. Gender-critical feminists will criticize huge numbers of... feminists in general should criticize women when those women are doing things which is at odds with advancing the rights of women as a collective, and there's no issue with that.
Watching her public descent into madness is bad enough. The potentially
it's wonderful.
Thousands of vulnerable people she's taking along with her makes me literally see red.
I mean, that's the first thing you get. That apparently, literally, the example of not including women in your feminism, not including biological females in your feminism, is saying some of them are mad, some of them are crazy, some of them, and of course, in this case, it's being used kind of in a hyperbolic sense, just mean buying into crazy ideas. So, I mean, that's obviously absurd. You're not excluding somebody from your feminism just by saying that they're buying into stupid ideas. It's absurd to say that means you're no longer including somebody in your feminism.
I predict a tragic end that will be ascribed to T-phobia.
And remember, being concerned about somebody's mental health potentially resulting in their death is not what you would do if you're advocating for somebody. Like, that doesn't make any sense. How is that not coming from a place of genuine concern? Like, she looks miserable. I'm concerned that she's going to... And they literally, didn't they say tragic end? Like, it's going to be a tragedy. I don't understand what the issue is here.
When discussing an article on why inclusive medical...
Okay, so basically, I just want to say that the summary there is it was mostly people criticizing actions and the implications of those actions, people worried about mental health and basically concerned for her. And then occasionally, there were some people making genuinely not very nice kind of personal insults about appearance or attitude. I said her a lot there. Like, the problem is, again, this is the issue, okay? So much of this has just been making a statement and then just providing a load of different quotes that all seem to be saying kind of different things with like different kind of meanings and intentions, and then not actually explaining why those quotes evidence the claim being made. You can say, well, they don't actually support trans-identified females, but that's not really, but if you just throw out like a load of quotes, like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be understanding here. Like, what part of those quotes, like, sure, I would agree that maybe the worst case scenario was the ones that were making kind of personal insults. But even then, personally insulting somebody doesn't mean you're not including them in your feminism. Like, if any radical feminist said, oh, that person's ugly, so what? That doesn't, it's irrelevant. Like, essentially what you'd have to get here is somebody saying that feminism should not actively advocate for the rights of Paige. And there was no example of that given. That would be the one thing that would prove the point, and you didn't have a quote to that effect.
Attached to a likely twisted and depraved man's body. Seriously, what is the world coming to?
We really are just on, like, look at random quotes from random people. Like, that's it. That's just where we're at right now. It's like, hey, I hope you're ready for some random quotes by random people you've never heard of that you will probably feel various different ways about. Like, some of this stuff I think is objectionable, some of it I think is fine. It's kind of just like occurring and just kind of randomly. It's like, I'll be like, oh yeah, that's fine. Okay, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. No, that's a bit, inappropriate, blah, blah, blah. And that's it. But I'm just like sat there like, what's the point in any of this?
May have believed the party line that gender critical ideology supports trans men. They might actually see trans men as lost women, and they feel empathy in that regard. But
little do they know, there are some random people on Facebook who have said some stuff that is maybe a little bit kind of mean and unsympathetic. Oh, goodness me, how I can't believe this happened. They really got tricked. They sure did. And those gay men wait until they find out that a bunch of people also said some like kind of speculative stuff about, I guess, like straight men who have sex with trans-identified males are gay or whatever. I wasn't really paying attention, but I've been paying attention for about 10 solid minutes of nonsense, so I think I've earned a break. Nothing. It's basically just, it has just been an onslaught of just random quotes and no substantial point of like, here is how, like that's saying that there's been no argument for like, here is how gender critical ideology hurts trans-identified females. Here is how gender critical ideology condemns gay men. There's been nothing like that. It's just been, here is a load of random quotes attributed to nobody from a random Facebook group, which the vast majority of people watching this, I imagine, have never been on, and some of it's kind of objectionable. Oh wow, how's the gender critical movement going to recover from that?
to them, trans men not only dilute
to them, trans men not only I live for obvious ADR.
As I mentioned before, there is so much information to convey that even hours of video feels like it's falling short, so you can find way more screenshots here.
I mean, speaking of that, that's an appropriate way to end with this part, because I was kind of thinking to myself, boy, I can't believe we got all the way through a 2 hour and 20-minute video about recruitment to the gender critical like worldview or whatever, gender critical point of view, without anything coming close really to the main reasons why I'm gender critical. Like, shockingly, I know this is crazy to imagine, but some people become gender critical without joining Facebook groups for boomer parents. I know that's crazy to imagine.
If you haven't seen part 1 of this series, arrête, go back. These are meant to be watched in order. The information
I would like to say, if you haven't seen the first 10 parts of my response, then go back and watch it. To be fair, I actually think we might still be just on part 3 right now, but we might be on part 4. We'll see.
There are no ad breaks in this series, thanks to my patrons on Patreon, so thank them or join them.
Yeah. Also, if you want to go onto my Patreon, because, I've got all these sponsors begging me. They're saying, please, we really want to be associated with what you're saying on your channel, because it's so compatible with the corporate interests of our company. But I keep having to say to them, no, I get my money from Patreon, thank you. But it is getting tempting. Anyway, have I even acknowledged yet that we're on part 2? Because we are on part 2. Obviously I know you guys watching this, but just it just feels like I should vocally acknowledge it, because I don't even know if I feel like I just silently just loaded it up and just kept plowing on through.
The claim that affirming trans kid is transing gay kids into straight kids requires that the trans youth was homosexual prior to transition. But plenty of trans youth also become homosexual by transitioning. A straight person that transition becomes a gay person. It goes both ways. Also, bi and pan people.
Wait. Oh, okay, I see. But this is dumb. Sorry, look, we're not confused about this. I just realized how dumb this is. So, because I was confused for a second, because it took a while for me to work out what was even being said, because I was like, what? So basically, the claim being made here is, well, sometimes people who are straight will become gay or lesbian because of transitioning. But the point is, the claim wasn't that literally, the sole purpose of transition is to turn people into straights. Like, that's not the claim. The claim is that gay and lesbian people do transition into straight people according to the gender dogma. Nobody's claiming that, like, I mean, yeah, it's just bizarre, because nobody was claiming that every single transition person has to transition into a straight person. Like, we're all familiar with the growing number of biological male lesbians.
So where are they getting this idea that youth transitioning is conversion therapy? Well,
from the other example of people who don't transition from straight into, and I'm seeing people pointing out, obviously, they don't actually transition from anything to anything else, but I'm just using that language.
They see gender non-conforming kids and assume they're gay.
No. What? No. What are you on about? That's not what happens. They see people who identify as men or boys who are attracted to other men or boys, and then later on they suddenly reveal that they're trans. It's not like, I don't know anybody who's just assuming that, like, effeminate men are automatically gay. Who's assuming this? This is ridiculous.
These accusations are nothing but projection.
What? Nothing but projection.
Arguing that youth being affirmed and socially transitioning isn't conversion therapy is pointless. The argument has been made, and anyone who chooses to believe that conspiracy theory will not be persuaded otherwise unless they want to be.
Okay, Caelan, you said the argument's been made. Where has the argument been made against the idea that trans identity is a tool for conversion therapy? By the way, it literally is in places like Iran. It's also, I mean, in many kind of other cultures, the idea of trans identity was the only way for two biological males to have sex with each other and it be deemed legitimate. This is, for example, there are African cultures where they had the idea of a third gender, and the idea was that if a biological male was gay and wanted to have sex with other biological males, well, they couldn't. I mean, I've kind of explained this before. Within a patriarchal society, interpersonal relationships become a nexus for patriarchal oppression. And that means that you can't have a relationship between a man and another man, because then how is the patriarchal oppression going to function? You know, like, one man can't oppress the other because it's the woman's role to be oppressed. So that's one reason why homosexuality has been stigmatized throughout history. And one of the ways around that, of many, but one of the ways was to say, well, actually, if two biological males are in a relationship, then one of those biological males must no longer be a man. And of course, yeah, that is what is happening now in Iran. But it's also, of course, yes, it has happened in some African cultures. And I won't give specific examples because, Caelan literally just was dismissive of the idea of even offering up any kind of substantial kind of thoughts on this at all. So I'm not going to be looking around for sources to make sure I'm completely clear on what language I'm using. I want to say it was the Igbo, but I am aware that that's just like quite a popular African tribe, and I might just be assuming like, oh, it's an African tribe, it's probably the Igbo. So we'll just say, I mean, if you want to know about it, look it up, because it's definitely a thing. But basically, yeah, like one of the ways of doing it would say, okay, two biological males are having sex, well, one of them must not be a man. And that's where you get the third gender category. I mean, actually, I think this is also pretty much the explanation for the whole idea of like being a lady boy in Thailand. Thailand, of course, an incredibly conservative, traditionalist country, incredibly historically intolerant of the idea of homosexuality. So what do you do? Well, if there's a biological male who wants to have sex with other biological males, oh, don't worry, it's not a gay relationship. It's not a relationship that's going to challenge or complicate the patriarchal dynamics within intimate relationships. Rather, it's a relationship between a man and somebody who's not a man. So yeah, this is simply, it's undeniable that there is a facet, and I mean, literally the one of the origins for kind of the whole idea of trans identity came from scientists in Germany who were trying to come up with cures for homosexuality. And it's not to say that they certainly weren't the only people to have come up with this idea. Many kind of people in the kind of late 19th and early 20th century were exploring this idea of men and women being, gay men being basically defective women, or in some way being, basically trapped in the identities of women. And there were some really bizarre experiments, which I'm sure you can imagine was typical for that time amongst the medical elite. But yeah, that is actually the origin, really, of this idea of trans identity, this idea of, well, there are men who want to have sex with other men, they must secretly be women, they must have women identities or something like that. And you can actually, if you kind of look back through the history, draw a pretty kind of continuous, John Money getting shouted out, but yeah, you can basically draw a continuous kind of progression from crazy wacko scientists sewing chimp testicles into gay men because they think chimps have like more testosterone, which is an actual thing that happened, right the way up to John Money forcing children to perform sex acts with each other because for some reason, for science. But yeah, and obviously John Money, of course, the person who literally came up with the idea, he coined the term gender identity. So, and was being celebrated amongst many kind of trans-identified individuals way into the 90s at the end of his life. So, whatever. The point is, there is so much evidence for this association between conversion therapy, the idea of curing homosexuality, or in some way allowing homosexuality to exist within a patriarchal society that would otherwise be hostile to the idea of homosexuality, by using this idea of trans identity to say, well, don't worry about it, they're not really gay because this person's not really a man. There's plenty of precedent for this.
Nicolosi makes it clear that the path to preventing homosexuality is to prevent any incongruence between the child's gender expression and sex.
Okay, so I went for a while using my bad webcam because a lot of stupid things were said, and I don't know, I was struggling. But basically, here you'll notice. So I don't really care. But basically, the point being made is that, well, trans conversion therapy is about preventing incongruence between expression and sex. But do you know what gender expression is? Or do you know what expression is? It's gender. So, and if you are gender critical, then you would think that there is no expression necessary to be associated with your sex. So gender critical people, like, already you have an issue. If trans conversion therapy is about preventing an incongruence between sex and gender expression, well, guess what? Gender critical people are fine with any kind of gender expression. They don't care about, whether or not your biological sex matches with your gender expression. In fact, gender critical people are far more likely to be critical of those who are overly gender conforming than they are to be critical of those who are gender non-conforming. And I think that's undeniable. Like, I've seen gender critical feminists kind of be a little bit uncomfortable with women who act out like femininity, traditional femininity, to an extreme degree. But I've never seen a gender critical feminist critical of a woman who acts out or kind of entirely rejects traditional femininity and doesn't express traditional femininity at all. So yeah, I mean, already you have an issue.
So this is a book held up as important and life-saving by a group of publicly anti-gay people. And that's just what you get when you pull back the...
Okay, so basically, so far we just had a very long section, which was admittedly good for making some progress, seeing as I had nothing to say about this book I've frankly never heard of. And apparently it's written by a Catholic woman, and it's been endorsed by a bunch of people who are homophobic. And the book itself is about how to, stop your kid from being trans-identified. I haven't responded to anything said because I don't think it's relevant. It's some random book written by some random Catholic person, and apparently it's popular in these Facebook groups for, like parents. I don't know. I mean, whatever. The point is, I don't know any gender critical people. Like, this is kind of a whatever, like, what do they call it? Degrees of separation situation, right? Because there were lots of homophobic quotes presented from people who have endorsed this book, but quotes which I would not expect to see from any gender critical person themselves.
But Maria takes it a step further and suggests that your child has been metaphorically or metaphysically replaced by a second person inside them who is the cult bizarro version of your child.
I like how this is being presented if it's like very silly, which it is very silly. But like, how is it any more silly than claiming to be a woman trapped inside of a man's body, right? Like, they're functionally the same level of silliness. You're still talking about some kind of weird metaphysical Cartesian dualism, which just is completely baseless and nonsense. I don't really see how I can make fun of one and not the other, and I'm happy to make fun of both.
She reminds me of me in gym class, standing by on my own net, and every time they kick the ball to me, kicking it in, because those stupid boys should be smart enough not to punt that germ-covered shit at me.
Oh, I see. So an own goal. Because I was going to say otherwise that would be the offside. I'll be offside, right? But no, yeah. I mean, it's fine if it's an own goal. I mean, that's not against the rules. It is very... That's kind of like admitting to be incredibly obnoxious. Like, the ball comes your way and you just intentionally own goal to sabotage your own team. You know what, actually, I've realized it's incredibly funny, and I wish I weren't playing this at 1.5 speed, because I guess it's just going to annoy everyone who watches this now, because I'm going to include it, based on the fact that the idea of intentionally getting or scoring own goals against your own team feels like it might be exactly the type of attitude that motivated Caelan Conrad to make this video, because this whole thing feels like one massive own goal.
Those inside the cult are the right, holy, and altruistic community, while those outside are dangerous, immoral, and hateful.
So, like, here's the thing. You'll notice this is from the book, which Caelan is saying is awful, and it's talking about trans identity as a cult, which kind of shows, like, the issue with just kind of, like, vaguely throwing accusations of being a cult at things. Like, anybody can do it. And that's why it's been very easy throughout this video for me to just pause every now and then and go, oh, lack of self-awareness. Oh, that's hypocritical. Oh, that's exactly what trans people do. Because it's super easy, which is why it's kind of boring, which is why this whole video is kind of pointless. And goodness me, are we making some progress?
I personally don't believe there should be guides on Amazon that include how to avoid CPS from finding out about the way you treat your child. Like, legitimately, I wonder when she was writing that in her book, if she ever thought to herself for a moment, what if this is wrong?
It's not so absurd to imagine that she might have, in this situation, or somebody might have considered that they were flouting the laws of the government, but thought that those laws were illegitimate, as indeed many people who have acted in opposition to the laws of their government have thought throughout history. There we go. Caelan does seem to struggle with this concept of, like, government laws being illegitimate.
The parent-child relationship has been respected and honored throughout human history and across cultures. Until now.
With no citations. Whether she is aware that this is not true, that white supremacy and colonialism has consistently degraded and disrespected the parent-child relationship, I don't know.
Okay, like, I don't really care, but, like, I wasn't sure where that was going to go in terms of that claim not being true. So the claim, I guess, is that Western European culture did not enshrine the relationship between parents and children as something of intrinsic value. And it's like, but, like, that's where the whole idea of the nuclear family came from. I can't really get my head around the idea of somebody offering up Western European culture as a counterexample to the claim that the parent-child relationship has been historically regarded as something significant and, I guess, of some kind of intrinsic value.
White women and men also owned black children and could do with them as they wished under the law without any regard for the...
Sorry, I just wanted to say, I find it hilarious how, like, tangential this whole thing is. Like, it's just one of those things, like, oh my god. Here's the thing. Like, this is literally, like, I don't know if this is a term, but it's a term I'm now coining now. Citation nerds. Like, when you say something that I think is kind of obvious, and just, like, most people would be like, yeah, that's just true. And then, like, someone comes along and goes, like, citation? And then, like, kind of just nitpick the point. Like, and that's all this is. It's nitpicking the point. Like, yes, nobody's saying that literally every single instance, like, every single culture thought that the parent-child dynamic was to be totally respected above everything else. Sometimes, in the interest of, I guess, like, racism and classism and whatever else, they would view that as superseding the parent-child relationship. But it's still pretty obvious that throughout, like, the broad claim of throughout history, the parent-child relationship has been respected in basically every culture, is something that's true, and it's something that you should be able to say without some citation nerd coming along and being like, offering up their stupid kind of boring nitpicks, which, by the way, are so massively irrelevant to the rest of the, the actual point being made here, that I'm probably only going to include this in the edited video simply because I want to point out how irrelevant it is, and also because if I only included stuff that was like relevant to gender-critical talking points, I kind of suspect that this video wouldn't actually have anything in it.
Our team prepares for and anticipates opportunities to have strategic conversations with a child where
this whole video is definitely like this specific part. I mean, like the whole thing is preaching to the choir, but this specific part is definitely preaching to the choir. Like if you have not bought into Caelan's nonsense yet, then this part is just so boring because it's not even like saying, it's basically just being like, we all know that gender critical people are a cult, right? Well, this is how they're a cult. And it's like, obviously, if you've not bought into that nonsense claim that the gender critical movement is a cult, then this bit's kind of irrelevant to you.
There's a lot of like Catholic demon possession vibes going on in the way Maria discusses trans identities.
Try back to the fact that somebody's already pointed out that, so Clive Simpson, is that his name? I would feel really embarrassed if I got his name wrong, but I've been watching quite a few of his videos recently because I only recently discovered him. So that's, if I'm getting his name wrong, that's why. But he has a whole video on how one of the kind of key advocates for the trans movement is actually a former key advocate for kind of the whole satanic panic thing. That actually there is an overlap between the people who believe that kids can be born in the wrong body and people who believe that kids might actually be demons possessed by Satan. And of course, that's not really surprising. It's not surprising to me that actually there is more overlap between the satanic panic parents and kind of movement of the 90s and the, trans affirming gender critical people trying to, make your kids commit suicide movement that is going on right now. But having said that, of course, this person in this case is a Catholic, and that's one reason why, it's a bit weird to hold them up as representative of the gender critical movement, which is, by the way, not Catholic.
Cut it off from its food sources. Challenge its assumptions and assertions. Do not give in to...
Challenge its assumptions and assertions? That's so cult-like. All right, everyone, so that was hopefully the end of part 4. I'm not even sure if I've recorded enough footage to get to the end of part 4, in which case this video probably won't be coming out on Sunday, and I think I'm just going to have to accept the fact that I'm not going to be able to have uploaded as many videos this weekend because I was away. But whatever, we'll see. Point is, this is the end of the video, so please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all that stuff if you like the video. And of course, if you want to go on Patreon, if you want to go on PayPal, that's already appreciated. If you want to do the kind of Amazon thing, that's also really appreciated. And thank you for watching, and I'll just say thank you to my current patrons.